SOS 333 Survey of Criminology students. So this is your instructor video for week 5, where we're focusing on LGBTQ plus perspectives as they relate to the prison industrial complex and all aspects of the criminal system. So one thing that I want to point out, we're reading a lot of excerpts from Captive Genders, which is an anthology of different essays written by folks who are LGBTQ plus identified for the most part. And they wanted to write about the criminal system. And so I want to share a little bit of that history with you because when I first read Captive Genders for the first time, I was taking a class that Angela Davis was co-instructing. And the way that she told the story to our class was that basically she was teaching graduate students at UC Berkeley, I think, and she was teaching about criminology and the criminal system, the prison industrial complex. I mean, you've read Our Prison's Obsolete, so you kind of get a sense of how she was probably teaching a criminology class in this really critical feminist way. And her grad students were asking, who's writing about the LGBTQ plus experience in terms of the criminal system? Like, it took, decades before folks were writing about girls and women and their experience, but now they've been doing, scholars have been doing that since the 60s and 70s. What about the LGBTQ plus research? And Angela Davis really didn't know of anyone doing that type of work and that type of research. And come to find out, at that time, there really weren't people who were researching queer criminology. And so her graduate students wrote these essays and created this anthology called Captive Genders. And so that's where this anthology that we're reading comes from. And I think that's a cool connection to make between Angela Davis's work and the folks who are writing essays for Captive Gender. And I think that probably helps explain to you folks in my class why I chose to focus and hone in on those two books. And so now jump to 2020, when I went to the American Society of Criminology, and they're creating a sub-organization for queer criminologists. That's how prominent this subfield of criminology has become. It's becoming mainstream. The National Criminological Association is creating a space specifically for people who do queer criminology. And I think that's pretty cool, considering how recent Captive Genders is, and the fact that that was published in, 2013, because there weren't people doing this type of research. And that just shows you how relevant queer criminology has become to criminologists. All right, so you got some Beth Ritchie, who's going to talk about Black feminism and sort of radical, intersectional stuff related to criminology. And I thought that her talk at Columbia, I thought that it sort of dovetailed with some of the things that the authors of Captive Genders are contending with. And then we'll we'll read some more from Captive Genders, but I guess some things I want to point out. Some of the essays in Captive Genders is pretty heavy. Like, it's probably going to be like challenging to read, not necessarily because it's dense, like maybe Michel Foucault's work, but because it's really like gritty. And so I want you to feel prepared for that type of content when you read these essays. But the reason why I include Captive Genders is because we need to acknowledge that this type of research wasn't happening for such a long time. And now that it is, we need to be teaching it when we teach criminology classes. And then thinking back to the week 4 video I made when I talked about the most vulnerable populations in prison. So when we're thinking about, trans and queer women of color who are so vulnerable in our society, and then even more vulnerable when they're incarcerated, like that's really the focus of Captive Genders. And the folks who are writing the essays for that anthology are saying, like, if we can't abolish the prison system for our most vulnerable folks who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, we can't make the prison system better for anyone. And so this radical idea of abolishing prisons, it really started with resistant movements such as Black Lives Matter. And they were really focused on Black men getting shot by police officers. And then that evolved into the Say Her Name movement, which I've talked about in previous weeks, which was focusing in on women who were experiencing police brutality and women who were leading the charge and starting these organizations like Black Lives Matter. And then we get to Captive Genders and we get to Stanley and some of these other folks who are participating in this anthology. And they're saying, well, actually, we need to focus on people who are, the most vulnerable in our society. And so when we're taking a critical approach to criminology and we are focusing on prison abolitionism, we can't just stop there. We can't just stop intersectionality. We got to think about the most radical ways of sort of dismantling the criminal system in the prison industrial complex. And that starts with the most vulnerable populations, according to Stanley and the folks contributing to Captive Genders. And so you don't just see the experience of trans women of color. You also see, like, there's an essay about butch lesbians. There's essays that are about the prison experience for the queer community, but there's also essays that have to do with other aspects of the prison industrial complex that aren't necessarily prison. And so the folks contributing to this anthology, they're thinking about how public space is criminalized, how being homeless is criminalized. And that's like an entire week's worth of material that we'll be covering a little bit later in the semester. And so we're not just thinking about prison when we're talking about the prison industrial complex anymore. We're talking about police brutality in communities of color. We're talking about how the war on drugs disproportionately led to the increased policing in poor neighborhoods that were primarily people of color living there. And we're looking at how women are policed, right? So like abortions becoming criminalized. That when that happens, you're making it illegal for women to take care of their body. And so we're thinking about the criminalization of women. And so these are just some different things that you should be thinking about as we dive into the LGBTQ plus perspectives as it relates to the criminal system and the field of criminology. And I hope that this week's material will demonstrate to students that queer criminology and the LGBTQ plus experience as it relates to criminology is not some fringe radical ideology. Yes, some of the essays you're going to read in Captive Genders, yes, that is more radical, but this is actually becoming an important component of mainstream criminology in the national conference that criminologists go to. And so I'll leave there. Don't forget to do your readings. Don't forget to do your homework for the week. And I just realized that this is kind of messed up. So I'll fix the discussion board title. It should say discussion board 3, not week 3, because we're in week 5, but it's discussion board 3 because we're alternating each week between discussion board forums and quizzes. But here you got your checklist, and that's all accurate. So yeah, it's discussion board post 3. And if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to me via email, or if we need to have a meeting in real time, we can always do that electronically. Bye, guys.